which just turned blue. Setting up webinar for YouTube Live. Seems to be working. Look, and there's me at least. Setting up webinar for YouTube Live. Seems to be working. Shoot. Look. Okay, cool. Okay, that's done. And the next thing that I learned this morning, guys, everyone who's already here, I'm still learning the ropes of like running the controls for that. What I will now want to achieve is that everyone sees us in gallery view. Hold on, that should have worked. You should now be able to see us in gallery view. I want to encourage everyone, the first thing, and that's why I will wait another 2 minutes or so before we actually start, is it would be great if all of you could do your feedback for us. Why do all of us keep insisting for that? A, it's like just 3 minutes for you. And B, we really need the feedback. We are doing this for the first time. We are the first people to really do that. And therefore we don't know where we screw up, and we don't know which things work particularly well. And we don't know how things feel. So please do your feedback. What else? Okay, so what that means is I will give everyone another minute where we will not be talking about anything, but where please everyone do your reflections, and we will just like super awkwardly be silent here. Yes, and Bing, I can just emphasize Vaishu's comments that you may have just seen. Today's videos were awesome, and that's totally true. Okay, so why don't we start? My name is Konrad Kording, and I'm mostly known for wearing pink hats. What you don't know about me is that I just ate mushrooms that we found ourselves in the forest, chicken of the woods, sulfur stacks. If I die during the broadcast, it's like totally normal if I misidentified them, the mushrooms. So in any case, it's a great pleasure for me to have the 3 panelists here. So we have Bing Brunton and Gunnar Blohm and Maria Geffen. And I want to give each of these the chance to briefly introduce themselves. Bing.
Hi, I'm so glad to be here. This is, I did one of these like 16 hours ago from one of the other time zones. So I'm really happy to be here. I think if you did some of the tutorials today, you've already heard a bit of intro from me and what my lab does. In brief, I'm an associate professor at University of Washington in Seattle, where it's actually lovely outside. So I've been working outside all day today. Had to move around with the sun, try to stay in the shade so I can see my computer. And I'm a computational neurobiologist, and I just really like building dynamical models of high-dimensional data, which are usually the type of models that explain behavior and neuroactivity, and ideally connecting the two. I like diverse model organisms. In fact, my lab works in everything between flies and humans. And we just have a lot of fun, just hanging out, and it's really nice here. So as you can see, it is a sunny day in Seattle. So this is proof. You now have proof the sun does in fact come out in Seattle, in case you were in doubt.
Awesome, Gunnar.
Well, you already know me all, so I don't know how much I have to introduce myself. But maybe I just want to say that linear systems for my research is really sort of the bread and butter. It's something we use pretty much every day. This is how I grew up. Well, after my physics degree, my first steps into neuroscience involved linear systems, the old school kind of electrical engineering type approach. But it has sort of like followed me along all the way. And as you will see, like linear systems will be very useful tomorrow for decision making, will be super useful the day after for optimal control. Everything is sort of based on linear systems, it seems. And hopefully by now you sort of understand why that is. And if you don't, then that might be a good question to ask. And while I'm super happy to be here, I'm at the same time a little bit sad that we had to organize Neuromatch Academy, because Konrad promised it would be not much work. But that turned out to not be true. And so as a result of that, I sort of had to neglect one of my big hobbies, which is brewing beer, as you know. And that usually takes like the whole day. And so I couldn't do any of that because I didn't have a single free day at all. But the silver lining is that since the weather is so nice outside now, and I have a nice garden, I could do a lot of vegetable gardening, and I'm very happy about that.
Awesome. Maria.
So I'm an auditory neuroscientist. So my lab studies the neural mechanisms for auditory perception and learning. I actually work at the same institution as Konrad, so we interact a lot with just a few buildings apart. And in the lab, we do experiments using a host of systems neuroscience techniques to record activity in the brains of largely mice, although we're starting to work with humans as well. We try to perturb specific neuronal regions to try to understand their function in behavior. And we also build computational models to try to understand our data, and also to try to model what actually happens in the brains. One of the key questions that we've been trying to understand is how do excitatory and inhibitory neurons interact together? So in the brain, largely, you can divide neurons into excitatory, the ones that respond positively to activation, and inhibitory, the ones that suppress when they're activated. And so we've been trying to build models and measure experimentally, and also understand their function and behavior, the function of specific or different types of inhibitory neurons. So I would say that in the lab, we actually have lots of projects, and so I can keep myself busy just doing lab stuff, but I'm also really busy outside the lab too. I have lots of projects. Well, first, 3 kids at home, which have been a bit of a challenge while we're staying at home and working at the same time.
All right, 3 kids.
But I'm also do sewing, knitting, play guitar, I play the piano, I do yoga, I do hiking, camping, skiing. There are very many hobbies and that I try to keep up with, and cooking. And, you know, I never feel like I'm getting everything done, but at least I try something here and there.
Awesome. So we start having great questions. Please continue contributing to them. Above all, start voting on them. So if you go to the Q&A, you find these like little thumbs up things on the left-hand side with which you can choose the questions that you most like us to discuss. But I want to start us with one question. So for maybe not Bing and Maria, but Gunnar has most certainly seen hats. This is the Y hat, and I most certainly also have a how hat. So if we talked about the different model types. So when we talk about linear systems and the kind that we talked about today, how do they relate to like these different model classes? You know, like, do they allow us to ask why the nervous system has the properties that it has? Does it allow us to figure out how the nervous system does things? Or are they just really good ways of describing how the nervous system is? Who wants to go first?
I can start. I can try to start. So what I can say with the most confidence is that they're good for these how questions, right? So you do an experiment, you collect data, and you want to fit a model to that data. You want to know how this is done. I think linear models and more dynamic systems models in general are usually a pretty good fit for that kind of modeling. I think it is not impossible to answer these why questions, but it takes a little more thinking. So there's definitely there's definitely examples, like I have some of my favorite examples is one of the outro speaker today, Chris Shnoy, gave, I thought, a really beautiful lecture on a lot of the work that his lab has pioneered over the years on how population encoding in motor cortex gives rise to these motor behaviors. And so there's a possibility of connecting these dynamic models to observations of actual neurons that they've recorded and start answering some questions of why. That's an opinion.
I can add something to that maybe. I mean, the what questions is sort of like almost trivial, yes, because as soon as you have how questions, that sort of like you know, incorporates or includes the what part. But sometimes linear systems can be used to simply identify parameter, sort of in a similar way as you do like dimensionality reduction, but just differently. So you have like, you know, a system and you want to parameterize that with a few, as few as possible, of course, parameters. So that can be useful. In terms of the why questions, sorry, did I say why before? I meant the how, of course. The why quest, so the how is, of course, like, as Big said, like the most appreciated application, I would say, of linear systems. The why questions sometimes we can also get at, but typically not by just using linear systems theory. So very often there's linear systems are included in addition to another framework, like optimal control, for example. You will learn about it, is based on linear systems of like description of, for example, the dynamics of a system. But then there's another layer on top of that that sort of asks, okay, how can we steer that dynamic systems by providing some inputs, for example, right, in an optimal way? And optimal will be defined in terms of some form of a cost function. So you can get at that, but typically linear systems are sort of like augmented to something else in order to get there.
Yeah, I just want to add that inherently, you know, the brain is nonlinear. Neurons are nonlinear. Within the neurons, the currents are nonlinear. How the inputs are sound is nonlinear. And so, but we can't really, it's really hard to operate in the nonlinear regime and try to make, you know, some conclusions about how things work. We do have many neurons, so we can average out those nonlinear units to get some measure of activity. We can average out the synaptic input currents. There are ways in which we can try to approximate this really complex systems with multiple or very high number of nonlinear units through linear dynamical systems approaches.
Cool. So now I want to start us off with a question of Gavinness and want to generalize the question a little bit. So where the question is, can the linear systems framework be meaningfully applied to a more coarse-grained spatial scales, such as fMRI or EEG or MAG? And like, I want to zoom us out a little bit from that question, sort of like, you know, like we have behavior and we have fMRI and we can like zoom in all the way to spikes. We could even look into the dynamics within individual cells. So at which levels of that hierarchy do you think that linear systems approaches can meaningfully be applied?
Well, it depends on what you mean by meaningful. My lab has applied it to both fMRI and EEG and electrocorticography data. I suppose it's up to you whether or not those attempts have been meaningful.
I think we can give you the meaningful in this case.
Okay.
Can you give us an example? Can you tell us a little about the study and kind of what were the results and what the limitations? Maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. So I hope partially what came across in the tutorials today is that it's just the qualitative types of behaviors linear systems can have in time. Right, so you have exponential growth, you have exponential decay, and you have oscillations. So you're allowed to have complex numbers, and we like complex numbers, which means you can get oscillations. That's one of the more natural types of time series data that you can model with a linear system. And so if you're thinking about oscillations, immediately a lot of EEG and ECOG data is oscillatory, at least if you have a sufficiently small window. And so Maria is absolutely correct. Like, we know that the brain is not linear. We all know this, right? Nevertheless, we persist in modeling things as linear systems because they're convenient. It's really easy. And if you put a small enough time window on it, it kind of works, right? So I think those are usually examples, or for example, we one of the things we've modeled with linear systems are these sleep spindles that we see in the electrographic record during stage 2 sleep. And they're oscillations that are usually around 14 hertz, and they have an envelope that's kind of the shape of a spindle. And if you take a sufficiently small window, it looks like a fine linear system. If you have a larger window, it's obviously not.
So and if you say linear, what exactly does it mean that it looks like a window? No, like, and I think this is one of the confusing things.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how can I look at data and say if the data, if the system underlying it is linear?
Well, so I think this may be going back to the distinction that Gunnar made earlier with is that like there's the how question, right? But to get to the why, to know what it is significantly harder. So I'm just going to stick to the how. I'm going to stay in my corner here and like talk about the how questions. And the how it's a very empirical thing, right? Like there's a model and it reconstructs the data. If the reconstruction loss between my model and the data is sufficiently small, I say it's close enough. I can measure the error, right? And I can say this thing is close. One of the things that I've often joked about is that I'm a member of the local chapter of the Flat Earth Society. I'm in my backyard right now. It looks flat to me, right? If you look close enough, it's flat.
I just wanted to add one thing. I think we use a slightly different wording. I think what you call how model is what we call what model. No, Gunnar, did I get that wrong?
No, I think we're about on the same page. I think potentially.
Okay, so Bing, let me ask for what you mean with the how model. So we had distinguished between a what model, which is just I fit a model and I'm happy if I'm good at fitting the model, and a how model, which asks what are like the biophysical mechanisms that
I see. Okay, then I'm using the terminology in a different way than you have. So I apologize for the confusion.
But I would actually also potentially use it in a different way, because the how models are not necessarily just about the biophysical mechanism. They're about any mechanism, as abstract as you want, really, as remote from the biophysics as you want, that can explain your data. So typically, when we talk about how models, in my mind, there's something about and they can be very abstract mechanics, essentially, that lead to certain behavior that is in there. You know, so do you think there's some feedback mechanism, for example? Feedback is the mechanics in that case, right? So something more specific than just saying, oh, here's the general formulation of a function, linear or nonlinear. I'm going to fit that with the data, which would be a what model.
Yeah, but I think this is a big difference in philosophy, no? Like, do I view the linear model that I fit to, say, neural data, fMRI, or behavioral data? Do I view this as getting at the mechanism, or do I view this as getting at like a description of how the data looks like?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it just depends on your question. That would be my answer. It's like, you know, what linear systems is not a model. Linear systems is a mathematical tool. It's like Bayesian statistics. It's not a model. It's a mathematical tool with which you can build models.
Are we really talking about what a model is now?
Well, sort of. We're going back to week 1, day 1.
Okay, good.
Yeah. But I think this is kind of important that to really point out that models use certain tools, but the tools themselves that you have seen so far are not models per se. They're just tools. They're pieces of math that turn out to be useful.
Right. So, but Maria, in your work, you're trying to push for mechanism, no? Like you look at the roles of individual inhibitory neuron types.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, we generally use linear, nonlinear modeling framework. But That said, you can actually describe many of the processes using linear systems and linear differential equations. And so we do use some of those tools as well.
I see, cool. So I want to go to a question by Alexander Ivanov, which gets at a little bit of, I think, what Bing like earlier on related to, which is, given that most real-world prompts that the brain faces are nonlinear, what would be some nice examples where linear approximations around critical points have been informative and insightful using linear dynamical systems? Well, that seems like a very legitimate question, no? Like it's a tool. It's a tool that we can use to like look at local properties of a system. We have reasons to believe that locally, as long as we're in a small part of state space, things should look linear. What would you say are like the big success stories in neuroscience of that?
Almost all. We almost always start with linear systems, and then we're like surprised how much they can describe, right? You look at the phenomenon, and Bing, like when you look at like EEG and like complicated stuff, right? It looks like super complicated in the data. You're like, oh my God, like how can I make sense of that? And then all of a sudden, like a simple linear model actually fits that. I think we're particularly bad of having intuition about what linear models can actually do, especially when you have systems, linear systems, where you have interaction of different components. For me, at least, intuition fails very quickly.
But there must be like, we should be able to give students like an answer of like, here's something that I found, like, no, you say like all the papers ever, but let's give them an example where we be like, yeah, this is beautiful. Bing.
So in my grad work, I was doing linear models of decision making, which I believe is the focus of tomorrow's lecture. Is that correct? Okay, good. So I think hopefully all of the students are about to see some concrete examples of how these linear systems are actually quite useful in modeling a large set of cognitive behaviors where people are thinking about things like memory and decision making and accumulation of evidence. I mean, there's like decades of work going back modeling memory and accumulation of evidence and discrete choices where they're essentially using Ornstein-Lunebeck models, just like the one that we went over in the tutorial today. So I would say that has been a really influential model that lots and lots of people have used successfully to explain memory and decision making.
And there's lots of other examples like this. I mean, if you think about, what's the simplest model of like subthreshold fluctuations of neurons, right? It's a very simple leaky integrated fire model. It's like a simple linear system essentially, right? And people have used that to explain decision making, all kinds of other things, working memory, among others. You can also think about the eye movement field, for example. David A. Robinson he came from electrical engineering, so this is sort of like my scientific background in terms of neuroscience. He has essentially reverse engineered the oculomotor system using linear system theory, and made very strong predictions about what the brain should be doing that have subsequently then been verified through electrophysiological recordings. And so that was sort of like the big breakthrough in the 50s and 60s, when people realized, oh my God, you can actually use these electrical engineering techniques, or linear system theory really, and understand somehow how the brain works through that, right? So that's another example. More modern, I would say, optimal feedback control, I mentioned that earlier, is based on linear system theory. You can think, oh my God, the arm is so non-linear, it cannot possibly work, right? Well, it can. And it's a really good description. Even the very basic vanilla type optimal feedback control is a really good approximation of movement in general.
Yeah, and if I can add one example that I personally find very beautiful, and it's maybe not entirely linear, but if we talk about ring attractors that insects use for navigation, this is just beautiful because like it's a small number of neurons. You can actually record them and see it happen there. So I think that there's like a great deal of like really exciting things in that space.
I mean, in sensory processing, you basically can model the transformation of the signal across the, the hierarchical brain regions as a series of linear filters that are integrated at each stage. So I would say in that sense, we use this framework a lot. Many times a question that we come up against is how do we describe the space that the brain is processing, that the brain is trying to understand. And it's often non-trivial. So with vision, we can start, for example, with pixels. With sounds, it's actually less obvious what the space for sound is. So we usually use something called the cochleogram, so the decomposition of the sound into frequency delimited bands. And so from there, we have to decide how is this information integrated. And so that's how we build these models with successive, with systems of filters that are built up and up and up until, for example, let's say I say the word neuron, you get a system that will be selective for the word prom. If the book that really got me into this is a book from, I think, the 70s by Marmorales and Marmorales that describes these linear systems really well.
It's a beautiful book, yeah. So let me go to the next question. So this is a question by Mariska Cal Olivares Dulce Maria. And the question is, are linear models good to model motor adaptation? If so, what will be the pros and cons of using these types of models? That sounds like Gunnar's kind of a question.
Yeah, I mean, the simple answer is yes. And people have in fact done that. And there's a whole, I would say, a whole industry out there that uses very particular paradigms in the modal learning field to study that and then essentially model the phenomena, the observations, the behavior through very simple linear systems approaches. So yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and maybe I can add a little because a lot of my research is in this cottage industry, as Gunnar just rightfully pointed out. So it's truly interesting the breadth of phenomena that these linear systems, when you do inference on them, that they can do for you. Like they can do obviously things where, let's say I perturb you and then you learn into the right direction. It's very easy for inference on a linear system to do that. But they can even describe things like you learn something and then you learn something else and then you learn better the third time it comes around, where you go into the same direction. And namely in situations where you say have a linear system with multiple timescales, it can really basically, and it can explain phenomena like spontaneous rebound, where I take a mouse or so, I shock it in some situation, and then I stop shocking it and like all good, and it learns that like now the world is good again. And then if you wait a little bit and put it back into the box, it believes that the shock will have come back. So these kinds of linear systems, as simple as they are, can describe like phenomena like that, which is truly shocking if you think about it, that these super simple models can be so broad. So, do either of Bing and Maria want to add something there on the motor model side?
I'm not super sure about the motor models, but we work on adaptation a lot in the lab. And indeed, the way to model it is with a linear model with a specific time constants, or, recently we discovered there are actually multiple time constants for different forms for adaptation to different statistical parameters of sounds. So yeah, I would say that's a really good approach.
Yeah, isn't it interesting how like almost the same model is used for modeling sound perception, or like the neural representation of sounds that is used for movement planning and the neural representation of movement. And that is why this like linear systems component is just such a clearly important component for all of NMA. So let me go to the next question. So this is a question by Colin Corbish. I will spare people the equation because it's really awkward to read equations. But the question basically says, we could have a model that is a linear model, but in which the matrix characterizing the linear component changes over time. So to which level can like these linear systems approaches be applied to those systems where we don't have stationarity over time?
Yes, the answer is yes. And that is, as everyone has said, a lot of these models where we're using linear systems, we know the systems aren't quite linear. And this is by far the most popular trick that people play, is that you allow that A matrix to change by some other process that you can define, right? I'll speak from kind of the data-driven perspective, where let's say you're handed data and you look at the data and you know that it might be well described as a linear system locally, but not over a long time, right? And so if you were to model as a linear system, the dynamics of the linear system, this A matrix, has to change over time. And to learn that, you would basically make a set of assumptions about the manner in which that it might be changing based on what you know from the underlying system. I'm thinking in particular of sometimes this is called switching linear dynamical systems, like LDS. There's a couple of different formulations of it. Scott Linderman has a nice code base, which has a Bayesian framework for inferring these A matrices and how they're switching over time. You can also do like a linear algebra version, which is what my lab has been using, but they're kind of the same in that you're just learning how the A matrices are changing over time to fit the data. And depending on how you believe the A matrices are changing, it could be changing. It could be changing like in a discrete way. So, for example, people have used this to model switches of behavior. Like, for example, walking is a cyclic behavior, right? So, like, as long as you're walking at the same speed, you're kind of just, that's one A matrix, and then suddenly you stop and you start doing jumping jacks, right? So at that point, there's a switch. So there's one A matrix that explains the walking, and then you learn the switch, and then there's a different A matrix that describes the jumping jacks, right? So then you would posit that there exist two different A matrices, and you learn how they change, and you learn what each of them are. You can also say that maybe the changes are gradual, right? In which case that at any given moment, your A matrix might be a weighted sum of 5 other A matrices, and you can learn what those are and how their relative weights change over time. And that gives rise to distinct matrices, A matrices, and that gives rise to distinct dynamics in any window of time. So there's like lots of tricks that people play to fit models of that kind. Maybe I should be saying models.
Yeah, and if you think about like arm movement control, for example, that I mentioned earlier, and if you want to actually make sure that you include the nonlinearities of the dynamics of the arm, then you can do something where you essentially approximate for each different posture, for example, the dynamics by the linear component. So the nonlinear dynamics are approximated now by the linear component, and that would essentially mean that this linear component changes depending on posture. So that's your A matrix changing as a function of what you currently are at. And so you can also put that into your model, because if you know the nonlinear dynamics, then you can just have a local approximation, linear approximation of those, essentially. So that would be the sort of like principled ways or an example of principled ways to do that, not data-driven in this case.
Cool. So I'd like to move on to the next question then, which is a question by Alexander Ivanov. And I'm sorry, I'm not going linearly in what's most upvoted. I'm trying to get at questions that like naturally flow into the flow here. So it says, given the outro video from Krishna Shenoy, is a representational approach necessarily at odds with the dynamical systems approach? Can the same model give us insights into both representation and the dynamics of the system?
I would say yes. But that just depends on how you build the model. Right? So if you take, for example, a recurrent neural network, that's essentially, or you can build in a way that it corresponds to a linear system, right? And then you can do like, you know, receptive field analysis or stuff like that. Sort of the kind of representation or analysis that allow you to get representations in the network. But it's essentially a linear system. So I don't think they're at odds at all. They're quite different concepts. I would say that in most cases, people would not necessarily connect them together, but I can imagine ways that you can actually do connect them together.
Yeah, so at some level, and like, correct me if you disagree with me, there is in the field this old question of, should we think of the brain as a representational system, with the idea that every neuron's firing kind of tells me like, yeah, there's a person here, or like my hand is at 9 degrees? Or should we think of the brain as a dynamical system where you can say, well, we have neurons and they influence what other neurons do? I don't understand that question like one bit. It's, I mean, like, the words make sense, but the words when applied to what we do and the logic, I just don't understand it. Because like, I mean, could anyone believe that the brain is not a dynamical system? I mean, like, hey, these are neurons that spike and influence one another. And at the same time, given that we see tuning curves of neurons everywhere, can anyone doubt that the brain is a representational system? So there is this debate, and I'm not quite sure I understand the debate. And maybe you guys have strong opinions about it.
I love this question because to me, it's really the fundamental question. We started out studying the brain, or there was kind of for a long time a philosophy that the brain is kind of like a computer and neurons are representing specific elements. And if only if we read off their activity, we will know what it is that they're encoding. And once we know that, we will know how the brain decodes that, right? So it is turning out to be less and less true. We understand that the representations in the brain are actually, they change depending on the context, depending on the behavioral task. So in fact, it's very possible that the representations are not really, single neuron activity, but rather it's some sort of distributed, maybe it's a distributed representation, but maybe it's just the state of the network. So I think it's a really important question, and it's kind of a deep question because we really need to try to understand what it is that the brain is doing.
But let me try and ask the equivalent. Now, you rightfully said that tuning curves are very context dependent. If I switch the context, tuning curves can be very different. But the same thing is true for dynamics. No, like, I mean, like, correct me guys if I'm wrong for that. But if I like fit a dynamical system to some brain data and I put the animal into a different state, I will get very different fits just as well. So I'm not sure I'm not sure then how to interpret these findings.
Can I add something to that? So I think I really like this question, and we can probably talk for the next 3 hours about it if we wanted to. But
20 minutes.
So I've worked a little bit on representations from the theory side, and what always sort of like shocked me is the fact that people don't question the idea that the way we define representations is with respect to an outside quantity, outside of the brain quantity, something in the world, like the location of the stimulus or a movement that the animal makes, right? Now, if you think about what a neuron does, a single neuron does in the brain, or even like an area or many neurons in the brain, the neurons themselves have no idea of the outside world, right? It's not like they sort of like have a camera to outside, right? And it goes like, oh, this is what's going on. I better encode like the position X because that position X might be important for my organism here, right? Neurons are hidden away. And ultimately, the brain as a whole has to carry out a certain task, carry out a certain transformation from the sensory input, maybe some memories, stuff that we have learned, right, to produce meaningful behavior. But at no point are any neurons, unless you're talking about primary sensory neurons or primary motor neurons ever in contact with the outside world, right? So to me, it has always been sort of like a puzzling aspect of this definition of representation and why this should be important at all. And in a way, you can argue that it, sure, it might be one way to get insight into, some form of specialization in the brain. And we know there are certain aspects of specialization in the brain, right? For example, like speech processing, math, that kind of stuff. But for the sort of like general, movement kind of behavior or sensory processing of natural visual images, like essentially that engages the whole brain, right? With a few exceptions maybe. And so do we really expect single neurons to be specialized somehow in a meaningful way with respect to specific aspects or attributes of the outside world? It has never made sense to me, but that's my personal sort of opinion on that. But on the other hand, I must say, on the flip side, it can be a useful tool to study transformation of information, because if you have sort of like whatever representation you want to identify, for example, between two neurons that are connected together, then you might learn something about the computation that happens between these two neurons. And this is where I think it might become more interesting. But again, this is my personal point of view. Don't take that as like, knowledge in the field.
So, but is that view, like it's a view that's popular in the dynamical systems field, but is that really fair? So you could say that, no, Gunnar is like already shaking his head. Like basically the idea that like a neuron directly relates to some property of the outside world. That is true, but like what is the alternative when we talk about like dynamics? Do we expect that the first principal component relates to something in the outside world? What is, in other words, kind of what is this alternative that we are giving? It's not enough to just say like, yeah, there's a problem with the other theory. The other theory will say like, yeah, principal component number 13 of brain data. Like, so what? You just fit like an OU process to like some brain data. What's the interpretation that we can give on the other side?
What is the other side again?
Well, Gunnar made the point that if you look from a dynamical systems perspective, maybe a linear systems perspective, then the idea of interpretable tuning curves is a somewhat dicey idea. And I'm just trying to argue that you could, if you sit on the other side, you could make the point that you look at tuning curves, you at least kind of know what like they mean, which is what the neuron does as a function of something. You could say, well, what is the equivalent if you look at the identified linear systems? I have a linear system, I fit something to it. Now, what does that mean? No, like, because you could say the same thing. No, like I can say the idea that like the linear system that I fit to some brain data represents some outside entity, it might be equally unlikely.
Can you think of it as a temporal kernel to some extent? They're dynamic modes, right? So it's kind of like tuning curves, but in time.
Yeah. But those dynamic modes also change from situation to situation.
They do, yeah, but I think wouldn't the interpretation be similar? Like if you wanted to look at it purely through the lens of representation, I could just say that, yeah, it's like the kernels that you've been fitting, the tuning curves, it's just this is in frequency space instead.
Yeah, I really like that view.
I agree with Gunnar and Maria and Konrad in that I don't see a problem here. I don't see those two views as being incompatible. I think sometimes I think about representations a lot, and I sometimes think about like really simple mechanical systems of the kind that you might learn about in classical mechanics, right? Like let's say you have a pendulum and it just swings around, right? if you wanted to model that system using the x, y, z coordinates of the point at the end, you're going to end up with or like some weird transformation thereof, right? You're going to end up with a really awful model. Like, you can do it, but it's going to be really awful. Where if you did it with the angle and theta, that is just a better representation, right? Like, don't you think like there's a possibility that, I mean, this is the same thing if you fit an RNN to a task, an arbitrary task of some kind, right? Like, it's learning a representation, and perhaps one of the things it's optimizing for is a nice parsimonious representation of the dynamics. It seems like you can have that as a joint optimization.
That's very interesting. I should just add for everyone, RNN stands for recurrent neural network, and we will get there. And it basically is just a way of fitting, if you want, fitting nonlinear processes, or alternatively having systems that have dynamics that you can fit to some data. Yeah. In any case, there's interesting questions here. Let me go to a more applied question here. It's a question by João Arauja. Oh my God, I'm so bad with names. I apologize to João, who asks, can we solve a dynamical system if the relationship between xk and xk plus 1 is not linear? For example, can we solve a dynamical system with gradient descent methods? And I think like, I want to zoom out just a little bit from the question and basically say, to which level can we take the things that we've been doing on linear systems today and kind of apply that to like a broader framework or a broader set of questions?
Well, the simplest thing I can think of, and I'm sure there's many more, I know that Gunnar already has more answers. I'll give one answer, which is that you can still look at the phase, you can still look at the phase plot. Those vector fields that we were looking for linear systems, those are really awesome when you have nonlinear dynamical systems. Because even if you can't solve it analytically, you can still plot what that vector field looks like, and you can get a really good intuition of just the qualitative behavior of those systems. That works just fine when it's nonlinear. That's one.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much I have to add here, really. I mean, as soon as you become nonlinear, it becomes like usually by orders of magnitude more complicated. But one thing to keep in mind is that typically when you think about nonlinear systems, you have or typically at least a very strong, a very dominant linear component. So in order for you to go digging into the nonlinear components, you really have to have good motivation to do that. And it turns out that in most cases, this is not granted, or at least I've seen very few cases where that seem to be granted. So yeah, so I'm not sure what else to say really here.
I want to recommend a book that really got me hooked on this, which is by Steven Strogatz, Nonlinear Dynamics and Chaos. It's just an amazing book. You can start it, with any level of math and really get, or high level or low level, and really get something out of it. And I think it now has more applications built into it. So that's something to follow up on.
I second that recommendation by Maria. Strogatz also has a YouTube channel, so I recommend the videos as well.
Oh, nice. I love that we can now find like most hard things explained by awesome people on YouTube. It just makes my life so much easier. I wanted to just mention, there's like lots of ways that we can use linear methods to look at nonlinear systems. One, for example, is that we can take a system that overall is nonlinear, and we can still locally view it as a linear system. And we can then, for example, stitch it together. Let's say we have a system that is nonlinear, but like we can locally approximate it as linear. And then we want to ask questions, say, is this a stable system? If it was a linear system, we could just look at the spectrum of singular values because it's only locally linear. There's techniques to kind of like stitch these linear things together. There's probably a lot of other applications as well, but like, yes, these books are amazing and so much to learn. Now let's see. There's a good number of additional questions. A lot of them are somewhat technical, and I want to spend like a few minutes on those at the end. But I want to take a funny one here, which is Amit Gag asks, why is it so difficult for humans to generate a random string for data? How random can we possibly get?
So this came up at the Q&A for the Asia session. And so my friend Jeff Ehrlich was in attendance, and he very, very correctly pointed out, I'm going to try to dig up the link. Humans can learn, humans and animals can learn to generate truly random strings of digits if we were properly reinforced. And so the observations was simply that you may not be inclined to do so, even if you think you are. Like, you can learn. Most people can.
I mean, I think, yeah, like the explanation for that is that we are just like constantly looking for patterns in everything we see and everything we hear. And it's really hard to break from that. You know, as you're listening to me talk, your brain is constantly predicting what I'm going to say next. If you didn't hear something that I said, you're going to be filling it in based on some sort of pattern detector that got activated or multiple levels of pattern detectors. So it's just really hard to break free of that.
And in fact, if you were to go to the casino and play roulette, and essentially, you know, it's going to be like red and 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 red, you'll be like, this is not random. This table is rigged. There's no way this can be random, right? We have this perception that randomness, it needs to change all the time somehow. And there's some famous examples where people have lost a lot of money by getting into this sort of over-interpretation, essentially, the pattern or recognizing patterns where they shouldn't.
Right. I mean, casinos must do like some research on trying to understand what is just like the right amount of reinforcement, the right ratio from reinforcement to risk or what. I think also we like numbers. So it's really hard to generate a string of numbers because, you know, like I like threes. And so I'm going to try to either not use threes or use threes. You know, it's complicated.
So I think I can produce almost perfect random numbers. And let me reveal the algorithm that I use. I take a long English word. I ASCII code in my head each of the characters. And I do it modulo 10. And it works like surprisingly good. It's not the fastest algorithm, but it produces a very hard to distinguish from randomness string.
Oh, I don't believe that actually works because the distribution of letters is not.
But the word is long, and I produce binary strings. Not like a character has like 26 possibilities.
Yeah, okay.
Even there, like it's possible there's more odd characters than even, or the other way around. But like once I add a few of them together, it gets to be pretty flat.
I thought you went like 0 to 9.
You have literally done that before.
Hmm?
You have actually done that before.
Yes. There are online randomness detection systems, and they can't distinguish me from random. But in any case, this is not maybe the algorithm that like we should be at this session thinking of. It's not like
not when I tell my 13-year-old he should not be using calculator to do multiplication or division. That is not what I mean. I don't mean you may use a calculator to generate a random string of numbers. You do not have to convert digits into ANSI characters.
I've long thought that it could be interesting in forensics. So there was a time where MATLAB would always initialize the random seed the same way. And I'm sure if one would go through all published papers in neuroscience, one would find a whole bunch of them where the data has been artificially noised to have the right statistics. And then we would find that it's correlated with the first n of the MATLAB random seed. And doing that kind of an analysis would just be crazy hilarious. But let me take another interesting question here. So, because I think it's a big question, and I will just paraphrase it. So it's a question by Miguel Nunez, who in a way asks, how do I know when I look at a prom that I should think about linear dynamical systems? And that's arguably like one of the most important questions. Like we now have the tool, like everyone who participated today has the tool Linear Dynamical Systems, and they go through a world with data sets and prompts and so forth. How will they know that, like, yeah, there's linear system right there?
I mean, I can answer, but I'm going to point back to day 2. First, you have to actually think about what you want to describe, right? And once you have a question and you have goals, then you'll, I mean, as I said before, linear systems are sort of like embedded in a lot of different kinds of neuroscientific neuroscientific models, right? We talked about optimal control, we talked about decision making, you talk about, you know, single neuron physiology. There's always some form of linear system behind there, or very often at least, right? So they tend to show up quite often. That's why I said earlier that in my lab, linear systems are like the bread and butter. We rarely use them in isolation, nowadays at least. They're always sort of like, you know, you have a linear systems, and then there's some, you know, fancy stochastic stuff going on, or you have a linear system and then you have a control problem, or you have a linear system and you want to learn something. And so it's sort of like always in conjunction. It's sort of like one of the bases, essentially. It's a little bit like Bayes' theorem. It's one of the bases of understanding certain aspects of time series and sort of linkages between variables, if you want, or parameters.
So, but there are a lot of labs. You know, I'm sorry to be overly realistic, but like not all research starts with, here I have a question, what's the right way of formulating? And maybe it would be better if that was the way it was, but I think the question is, and I'm sure some of our students will be confronted with it, like someone generated that data set, it's been recorded, it's on the hard disk, and someone's like, hey, can we do something cool with it? Under which circumstances? I mean, like, I'm sorry to put you on.
There's a key notion of, you know, variance explained. And so you can look at your data set, you can try to quantify how much variance there is and how much does your model explain. And then you can try to sort of account for what does the linear model do? How much better does a nonlinear model do? You can get a sense for how much of the data, of variability in the data you're capturing with your model.
Yeah, I think that's actually a very interesting point, that in a way, to know how good your linear model is, one way of doing that, as Maria just pointed out, is we can fit a nonlinear model with machine learning and all bells and whistles to it, to just have that as a yardstick and then say, like, look, like my linear model is like really very close to what we can get with nonlinear models.
But another way to think about it is to say, well, where does the data come from, right? If it's a purely random process, for example, with no underlying or nothing underlying or nothing you can identify, at least that's behind it, and maybe linear systems is not really a good way to approach it. You should use pure statistics. But as soon as you have, like, for example, dependencies, right, like in time, for example, or maybe in space, then if these dependencies in particular follow the Markov rule, then linear system is probably a good idea to think about.
Cool, great. So we just ran for 1 hour. There's a lot of technical questions in our deck at the moment. I don't think we can take those technical questions. They are a lot of those questions is kind of unless Bing sees like good questions that we should still take of those nature. They're great questions. They're like really good questions there. It's just hard to like meaningfully answer them without like writing it out, I think, and giving much more detailed answers to it. And also the hour's over. So I think Do any of you want to advance one of the more technical questions? Because otherwise we'll just wrap up now. Okay, I think we'll just wrap up. So I think it was a great Q&A session that I think helped me certainly a lot, like think more cleanly about what these models can do for us. I want to give the panelists the chance to each give us like a 2-minute like outro statement. And I think I'd like to start with Gunnar, Maria, and then Bing. And let me just say, the thing that is so important for this is linear systems are the easiest dynamical systems that we can have. They, in a way, are the baseline, the lower baseline that we compare everything against. If the linear model is already very good, then why go further? I sometimes find in the literature papers that do something very complicated and don't check the linear models. So I think whenever you try and describe the dynamics of something, you must, under all circumstances, first fit a linear model to like give you an understanding of how linear or nonlinear the system is. And with that, Gunnar, what would you say?
Yeah, I was going to say something very similar to that, actually. and actually, so I think yesterday and today, so Bayesian statistics and linear systems are sort of, to me, the building blocks of 99.9% of any kind of modeling you will ever come across in neuroscience. And I think this will be reflected in the rest of Neuromatch Academy, definitely this week, but also next week, where you're going to learn about, single neuron biophysics and how to model that. You will learn about, deep neural networks, and they're all based on the same concepts that you've learned yesterday and today. So I think I'm going to leave it at that. So they're really important concepts, and a good understanding of those, not necessarily now, but later if you want, is really helpful in all kinds of different domains. So if you want to invest a little more, this is a good place to invest.
Maria.
Well, I guess understanding linear models, or trying to understand how to use them, is really important. It's kind of like the key first step that you have to start using, but you can also study them your whole life, and you're never gonna run out of questions that you can fit in your model to. So the brain is complex. Complexity builds up from the periphery into the central nervous system, into the cognitive centers, into perception behaviors. So I'm really hoping that we're gonna solve that in our lifetime, but yeah.
Yeah, I really liked everything that Gunnar and Maria said, and I completely agree. So I'm just going to try to add something that's in a slightly different direction for the sake of variety. So the topic of that you'll learn in a couple of days with the optimal control theory in a couple of days has already come up, and so I'm just going to further try to motivate that, because for me that's one of the key reasons why I really like linear systems, is because oftentimes we don't just want to build a model for the thing, we want to control the thing. And when you want to control the thing, controlling linear systems is really well understood. Controlling any kind of nonlinear system is much worse. Like, we just don't know how to do it, right? And so if at some point you want to be able to poke your system and do something with it, then having a linear model, even if it's not the best fit, sometimes this is just a really good idea, because it allows you to then leverage this other math of control theory to then bring that to your system. And so in case you were not already looking forward to that, look forward to that.
Great. Well, thanks so much to all our panels. Thanks for all the great questions from the audience. We can't hear you, but I think this is a delightful discussion, and thanks so much everyone for participating. See you.
Thank you.